When we talk about air pollution, we usually think about smoke, dust, or traffic. But what if some of the most dangerous pollutants in the air are the ones we can't see, can't smell easily, and often don't even know exist? What if the air inside our homes, offices, hospitals, and schools is sometimes more polluted than the air outside? Today's guest is someone who works exactly on these hidden threats, the science behind what is really in the air we breathe. We are joined by Dr. Caroline Widdowson, a globally respected expert in VOC and SVOC monitoring, air quality science, and advanced analytical technologies, and currently the Director of Scientific Affairs at Markers International UK, one of the world-leading companies in air sampling and thermal desorption technologies. Dr. Widdowson has more than 20 years of international experience in analytical chemistry, environmental forensics, industrial hygiene, and emission characterization. She holds a PhD, an MBA, and is a member of Royal Society of Chemistry and actively contributes to ISO committees and global regulatory frameworks. Her work sits at a very unique position where cutting-edge laboratory science meets real-world problems. From monitoring air inside buildings, factories, and cities to tracking invisible pollutants like VOCs, odorous compound, PFAS, and microplastics. Dr. Widdowson helps government, scientists, and industries understand not just that pollution exists, but exactly what kind of pollution it is, where it comes from, and how it can be controlled. She has played a key role in developing and promoting global best practices methods using advanced tools like thermal desorption, GCMS, online VOC analyzers, and real-time emission monitoring system, technologies that are now used across Europe, the US, and Asia to protect public health. What makes her perspective especially powerful is that she doesn't work just in a lab. She works directly with the regulators, environmental agencies, researchers, hospitals, and industries, translating complex chemical data into practical air quality solutions. In this episode, we will explore what VOCs really are and where they come from, why indoor air can be more polluted than outdoor air, how even odor-causing chemicals matter for health, how countries around the world have controlled air pollution using smart monitoring, and how new pollutants like PFAS and microplastics are becoming the next big environmental challenge. Let's begin this deep and global conversation with Dr. Caroline. We warmly welcome you, ma'am, to our platform. Could you briefly explain what are VOCs and why they are becoming such a critical air quality concern globally and in India too?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for having me today. So VOCs are volatile organic compounds. So they are a carbon-containing molecule that is produced from many different environments and sources. They are found to be evaporated in air from things like exhaust fumes, industrial emissions, but also found inside buildings from household products or cleaning products, even cooking.
Ma'am, is it same as carbon footprint or different from it?
It's a little bit different from carbon footprint in that when we talk about carbon footprint, we're often talking about the carbon that we produce when we travel or when we import food. What we're talking about here are compounds that can affect human health that we breathe in, either from ambient air or interior environments, but also compounds that can cause concern for humans in other ways than health, maybe an off odor, something unpleasant.
So, ma'am, why is VOC monitoring essential beyond just PM or NOx?
Yeah, so PM and NOx don't give the whole picture. Volatile organic compounds are often the precursors to ozone or to secondary aerosol emissions. And so it's important for us to understand the whole picture. Yes. And VOCs can also be very toxic. Some of them are carcinogens, so they cause cancer. And it's important that we understand where they're coming from and what effect they're having on us.
How significantly is indoor VOC exposed compared to outdoor?
It's a good question. It depends on the person and the environment that they live in. Post-COVID, I think we realised how much time we spend indoors. So VOCs from materials inside the home have a big effect on your health. I think the last statistic I heard was that we can spend anywhere up to 90% of our time indoors or in our vehicle driving to and from the office. And all of those environments have volatiles that are created from the materials that we inhale in our day-to-day. So I think ambient air and environmental monitoring has more pressure on it, in that it's a very visible issue around the world. But it does seem that indoor air quality is becoming much more of interest.
How do VOCs affect human health in the short term and long term?
Yeah, it's a really good question. We don't know as much as we should about these compounds. Some of them are clear carcinogens. We know that benzene, formaldehyde are problematic. But there are tens of thousands of these compounds, and some of them are very new, and we don't know the effect that they have on our health. But I think it's clear with the rates of different diseases and cancers and other such things that something is causing them, and it could well be these compounds.
Ma'am, during your lecture, you show some things like these. Can you explain detail to our audience?
Yeah, sure. So during the lecture, I talked about the use of adsorbent tubes, and these tubes contain different adsorbent material. And what we do is we pump a sample onto our tube, and the compounds of interest end up being taken onto the tube in this direction. So what we have here is a weak adsorbent material that traps some of the bigger, bulkier, semi-volatile compounds. And the more volatile, the smaller compounds pass through that, and some will get trapped on our medium sorbent. However, some of those very volatile compounds will pass through both of those, and they will get trapped on this strong adsorbent material at the back of the tube. Now, if we were taking a sample from this environment, we would take the sample, we would pump onto the tube, maybe at about 50 to 100 milliliters per minute, and for a certain period of time. So we would know the volume that had been taken onto the tube. We would then cap this tube, keep it safe, take it back to the laboratory, and we would analyze that. And we would do that by placing it into the analytical instrumentation, and we would heat this up very, very quickly and pass a flow of gas through this tube to release all of those compounds in the opposite direction, we call it back flushing, onto a secondary focusing device. This secondary focusing device is very similar to the tube in that it has multiple sorbents of varying different strengths inside. So the sample will come from the tube onto the focusing trap, again our weak, medium and strong sorbents. We hold this trap anywhere between -30 and room temperature, depending on the chemicals we're interested in. And then we heat this trap up very quickly, 100 degrees per second, and we reverse the flow of gas through here, and that is what is introduced to our GC column. And we introduce this very tiny amount, a couple of hundred microliters of gas, and that allows us to have really good sensitivity of our compounds of interest.
Thank you so much, ma'am, to share your expertise to our platform.
No problem.
How are countries like China, the UK and the USA addressing VOCs monitoring and control?
It's very different in different areas. I think in the UK and Europe, we have been monitoring VOCs for quite some time now, especially benzene, toluene, xylene, those types of compounds, either from an ambient air monitoring perspective or from a source emission from industrial environments. So the regulations and standard methods are very well entrenched in in those areas. What's been very interesting has been the rapid growth of environmental monitoring and policy within China. So in about 2016, there was a 5-year plan that came out. It was called the 13th 5-year plan. And in that plan, air quality was one of the focuses. So during that time, from 2016 to 2020, there was a vast increase of adoption of measuring VOCs in China.
So we can say that different regions, different monitoring age.
Absolutely, without a doubt. Not only do they monitor for different chemicals, but they have different methods, they have different policies that regulate. So most of the places that you monitor now, it is driven by the fining of industry if they over-emit, which is important to do because that's where most of the source of ambient air comes from, but also looking at things like vehicle exhausts. There are regulations surrounding the emissions from those. Not all of those include VOCs, so it's important to to continuously look at all these different pollutants.
So what are the most advanced global technologies used today to monitoring VOCs in outdoor air?
Yeah, so thermal desorption is one of many different techniques of what we kind of term pre-concentration. So you can take a sample onto one of these tubes, like I mentioned, or you can take a sample using a canister, or you can just draw a sample into a stationary housed analytical system. So you have kind of offline and online. The thermal desorption aspect is very much about how you get a sample into a GCMS spec. Now, when it comes to the majority of applications, a traditional GCMS spec single quadrupole is suitable. However, we are seeing a lot of movement towards much lower trace levels. So for example, if we look at things like PFAS, which is a new emerging contaminant group of compounds, a lot of that is targeted analysis using triple quadrupole or mass spec MSMS. But in addition to that, when we're looking for odors, often the odors are hidden in the baseline of our analytical data. So we also utilize two-dimensional chromatography and time of flight mass spec to look for some of those real trace compounds in very difficult matrices.
But how is indoor air quality monitoring different from outdoor air?
Outdoor air is very much about taking a sample of the outdoor environment and coming back and looking at the number and saying whether it is too high or too low. When you do that in indoor air, you know that the source is very close. So you know that the source is in the room with you. So when we do indoor air testing, a lot of the regulation is actually based on materials testing right before any of the materials make it into the home. So for example, in Europe, we have the construction product regulation where flooring materials, ceiling tiles, paint, different types of adhesive are limited in the amount of VOCs that they are allowed to emit into the environment. Likewise, we have similar regulations in the US and in parts of Asia as well.
How does Marker Technologies supports VOC monitoring globally and in India?
So Marks is a really unique analytical instrument manufacturer in that we spend a lot of time being involved in the standard methodology and talking with people like yourself today and this great event that we held, in that we don't just want to respond to standard methods that are written. We want to be involved and to help organizations understand what technology is out there and to really give people the best tools to have to their disposal to deal with this problem, not just in environment or in indoor air, but anywhere that we find VOCs.
At last, if you had give one message to the world about invisible pollutant, what would it be?
I think that to understand these pollutants, we need to be able to measure accurately and robustly and reproducibly. So what I always say to people is that you can buy the best analytical instrument in the world, but if you don't pay attention to the sampling and to how you take a sample and to how you validate your analysis using things like internal standard addition, being able to reanalyze the same sample multiple times, being able to use internal standard addition, leak testing, all of these things, it's really key that you have the ability to feel safe and confident in the sampling and the analysis and the data. So it's all the fun things of quality control and capability of the instrument.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your valuable time and share your expertise to our platform. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
After the podcast, we now move forward to Dr. Caroline lecture in the workshop, Green Fuel for Better Air Quality.
Thank everyone here for inviting me today and for welcoming me today. I arrived in India at 3 a.m. the night before last, and my first day I got taken to the Taj Mahal. So I think I've probably had the best first day in India that many people get. So I really do appreciate the very warm welcome. So I was asked here today for two reasons, really. One is to give a bit of a global view on ambient and indoor air monitoring, regulation and standardization. For the last 20 years, I've been working on sampling and analytical methods for VOCs and SVOCs in a range of different environments. So that is indoor air, in vehicle air, emitted from products, materials, semiconductors, computers, how our mobile phones affect us, all the way through to the ambient air quality that we've been focused on today, as well as new energy and fuels. In addition to that, we also work in the food industry, looking at adulterants in food, off odours, anywhere that you can find VOCs, SVOCs, we are interested. All the way through to some of the more difficult topics like chemical warfare agents and forensics and detectives. So our instrumentation can look right down into the super trace level, picogram levels of chemicals, all the way through to percent level concentrations. Okay, so what I'm going to cover today is the international perspective on some of the monitoring and controls of ambient VOCs and indoor VOCs. I am going to talk a little bit about global trends. I am not the knowledge of everything. I sit on a lot of committees in the US, in the UK. I've consulted with the Chinese government and the Japanese government. I work with our colleagues here. So I have a broad overview. There is no right or wrong way to do any of this, so it's just my opinion, okay? So I'm happy to have debate about this. I will also go a little bit into indoor air quality, which we haven't spoken about today, but is something that's very important to what underpins all of this, which is the effect that VOCs and SVOCs have on human health and human comfort, and the progress in each region as to what we're testing and why we're testing it. I will, if we have time, talk about some of the analytical challenges that we just touched on. If not, then we can talk about it over lunch or after lunch, okay? So one of the points that came up today is that there is a big drive behind all air regulations which looks at net zero, and there are some great numbers thrown out in the media, and all of us who work in air quality kind of look at it with a little bit of a pinch of salt when we see all of this media attention that has suddenly come onto our world that we work in. And there is a strong global shift, and whether that's based off of funding, policy, or just general desire by a region to implement, it has very much focused on greenhouse gases and on the PM measurements that we've spoken about. But I care about VOCs and SVOCs, okay? So what I always think about is, what are the unintended consequences of this type of regulation? Where does it put us as people who are interested in this area? And air toxics and odor issues, they've actually got a relatively low visibility, as Dr. Tyagi mentioned today. They're not as important as someone like he or I would like them to be, because we feel like they're something that we all should be looking at. And there's a very fragmented oversight of the validation of these compounds. And often it can fall in between the regulatory gaps in various regions. So why does it matter? And actually, all of this is just words and things that we know. But what I really like the thought of is that communities experience daily air quality, not the annual carbon number. That's not what matters, right? We have looked at regulation around the world, and you can get a good value during the day, and then everyone turns their back, and suddenly industry pumps out a load of stuff at night, and we don't get the numbers for that. That's what was happening in China, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail going forward. So all these great numbers that everyone was getting is because we were taking a snapshot at a certain point of time, not an overview. So it's all about how we monitor responsibly, but also, as you said, ensure that governments are taking it responsibly. But because until there's limit levels, until there's fines on industry, until industry has to pay for it, people aren't going to actually carry out the monitoring. Okay, so let's get on to kind of the core drivers behind this. We know that there's the public health aspect. We're very aware of the effect on human health that volatiles and secondary pollutants have. What we're seeing as well now is a lot more about human comfort. It's not just about what's carcinogenic and what's going to actually cause us problems, but it's about human comfort. Do we live next to a landfill site that is very odorous and causing really unpleasant living conditions? Are we living next to somewhere that's started to be regulated for one compound, so they've switched to another, which isn't known what the toxicity is yet? We need to look for everything to understand this, and we need to continuously educate ourselves and get defensible science-based enforcement of these volatile compounds. So it's not all just about what leaves the stack, it's now about what affects that community that we are looking at, and that's where a lot of these methods come into play. So I am going to go through a couple of regional areas just to talk about what we've done in other places. And I mean this with the greatest sincerity. I am not suggesting that anyone is doing it correctly or better. Okay, I know I'm British. I know we've kind of left the European Union, so we've got a little bit of an unstable relationship there. I spend a lot of time in America, and we won't go into details about the political situation there. So this is just about what people do and what they're identifying. So in the European Union, we have the Ambient Air Quality Directive, which focuses primarily on benzene and a select group of volatile organic compounds. And we have these kind of best available techniques specifications. So we will rely on EN, which is the nomenclature that comes from a method that's written by CEN, which is a French acronym basically for the European Central Normative Group. And we on CEN have representatives from every European country, not EU participants, so we haven't been thrown out of CEN, so the UK is still participating in writing those methods, or from ISO, which obviously is the more global way of looking at these. And we tend to address the fugitive and the diffusive emissions from the industries. Odor is not regulated uniformly across across the EU level, but each regional or national level has their own regulation to look at odors, and we can have a little look at those in a moment. There is a huge emphasis on standardization, traceability, accountability, precaution, precision. A lot of you are from metrology institutes. You know my colleagues in VSL, NPL, HSL, all of these places that create gas standards to the most accurate degree that are then mandated in most of our EN and ISO methodology. So one of the questions you asked earlier about how we validate those compounds, by using very expensive gas standards, if I'm completely frank with you. It's probably one of the most expensive parts of the process, is buying a 65 compound validated gas standard is vastly expensive, but it's what's mandated by these regulators. In the UK, I put that here because I have to, because that's where I'm from, so I have to just give a little snapshot of this. What's interesting, and I thought I'd highlight here, is that odour in the UK is viewed as a nuisance, a public health, not a public health issue, but like someone playing their stereo too loud or someone being antisocial. Odour from an environment is a public nuisance. But actually we regulate those quite strictly. So it's kind of a nice way to get around some of the broader environmental regulations by putting it under a Public Nuisance Act. We do ambient air monitoring. We have stations positioned all around the UK. We enforce source emissions, so we have passive sampling around refineries. We don't do a lot of manufacturing anymore. We don't have a lot of petroleum refineries anymore, so our pollution levels are very low. It's not so great for our economy, but our pollution levels are very low, so we kind of have that balance there. Odour management is very much on impact assessment. So not only is it chemical analysis, there's a lot of citizen science, of talking to residents, identifying where the problems are, seeing how that affects them. We had a really interesting thing happen in the UK probably about 5 years ago now. A young child who had asthma died, and it's the first time in the UK that the death has been put down as air quality related. It was the first time that it was mandated that this was actually due to air quality, as opposed to a respiratory issue. It was because her school and her home were next to very busy industrial areas. And that kind of flicked a switch in the UK policy, where the government ministers started to really push interest in that and used it as part of their lobbying and their kind of their personal beliefs to get elected, was we want to be interested in this. So we have had a change in that. We move to the United States. Now, those of you who are familiar with ambient air quality monitoring, the US EPA, their methods, their TO15 methods, which is their canister methods, their TO17 methods, which is their pumped onto a sorbent tube, their PAMS network that Dr. Tyagi showed, that is 45 sites that continuously monitor every hour, on the hour, looking at all of those issues, has always been seen as the gold standard of ambient air monitoring. Said I wasn't going to talk about politics, but I'm just going to say that over the last 8 years in the 2 Trump administrations, I would say over 50 to 60% of the EPA scientists that work on this have all lost their jobs and have all been moved into other positions or into other areas. The focus on environmental air quality in America has lost so much of its kind of momentum. However, the methods are in place and the regulation is still there. What's interesting is that PFAS, which is the new buzz phrase in environmental monitoring, in water, soil and air, is all still fully funded in the US government. So everyone who worked in that area has kept their roles and is proliferating those methods going forward. China is a fascinating case for air monitoring, and we've spoken about this at length individually, but I think we talked about the Olympics, which was kind of a point in time in the Chinese development where they knew that they needed to deal with the air quality. Now, at that time, you can't, they put things into place, but the reality is it wasn't until the 13th five-year plan in 2016, which is when the government invested a vast amount of money into air quality monitoring. Great for people like us who sell instrumentation. I'm going to be completely frank with you. It was an incredibly busy time for all of us. Most of us that live in the UK pretty much moved to China for 2 years, whilst every single Tier 1 city, so this is your Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen cities, every single EPA laboratory, every single contract lab was given money to run air quality monitoring. Then Tier 2 and Tier 3, all this funding filtered down. So the ability to get tenders and quotes, and all they wanted was the same standard instrumentation that was used in Europe or the US. So they based very heavily on what was being done in those regions. So there was this vast increase of implementation, fence line monitoring of petroleum sites, background monitoring of very low level concentrations. And really what has improved their air quality so dramatically was the government's kind of pushing behind this to fine every single industry that did not comply. And then that paid for the money that needed to then implement the testing. So it was this kind of cycle. Now, again, we're not all in a political scenario where we can implement something like that, but that's how China did what they did. What's interesting now is that testing is totally routine, totally implemented, and that's just ticking over now going forward. And very much the emphasis is now on emerging contaminants, microplastics and PFAS. And in fact, the great work done by the Chinese EPA in implementing new methods faster than the US and writing new standards, using new technology has taken over Europe and the US with regards to advanced technology. Okay, I put this in just as a cheat sheet because I'll share this with you. But if I was to go around these areas and look at the region, the kind of, this is your background ambient air monitoring methods, and the methods that we use in different regions. They are all based off of canisters or sorbent tubes using pre-concentration GCMS spec, all single quad applications, all looking at a range of targeted compounds between 30 and 65 compounds, depending on where you're based. In China, they've just got a method that is for 117 compounds. It's very, very complex. It includes everything from formaldehyde all the way through to naphthalene in one analytical system. Any of you who run this type of work will know that trying to sample formaldehyde and naphthalene in the same container and then analyze it is very, very complex. Luckily for us, we've managed to sort that, and that's something that we can do with some caveats, as always, with an advanced technique. We then have ozone precursors. This is the online analysis. This is your 45-minute drawn sample into an analytical instrument, typically with dual FID, looking at those range of compounds. We then have fence line monitoring, which tends to implement some of the techniques that Dr. Tyagi talked about earlier, tends to be passive analysis. Sorbent tubes placed out into the field for 2 weeks, looking at the concentration of benzene, toluene and xylene over 2 weeks. This type of analysis is complementary to the much shorter term, because it's looking at what happens over that longer period of time. You remember I said sometimes we come across, I'm not suggesting that anyone does it deliberately, but we come across where people time their short sampling when nothing is being emitted from their facility, and then they kind of emit things and they don't get tested. This longer term analysis allows you to make sure that that isn't occurring. I don't want to suggest that we can run before we can walk, and I think this is always a tricky thing to look at is regards to emerging contaminants. We've already mentioned that perhaps VOCs are not as regulated as we would like them to be in India. However, I think it's important that if you're going to invest in technology that allows you to look at all of these, it's important to know what else you can do with it. So you can use the same instrumentation for air toxics, ozone precursors, the BTECs, as well as PFAS and microplastics. I'm going to come to microplastics in a minute because it's somewhat separate. PFAS, a load of regulation coming into various different applications, and I'll touch on that at the end if I've got time. Microplastics, I'm talking specifically about microplastics in air. Okay, microplastics in water, microplastics in sewage treatment works is typically done by pyrolysis GCMS spec. However, there is a new area of interest looking at the off-gassing of those microplastics to identify where have they come from. We can do forensic type analysis on microplastics to see what company made them, what tire they've come from on a vehicle. So we can, there's research going on in Europe at the moment that can say that tire manufacturer X has a worse release of microplastics than tire manufacturer Y using GCGC time of flight. It's a contentious subject at the moment, because obviously this type of data then opens up an entire industry to have to be responsible for the release of microplastics into our environment. Again, just a cheat sheet of names and applications that we run. So if you don't mind, I am going to go into a bit of detail. I know we've had 2 presentations that have touched on this, but I do just want to, I probably should have gone first because I hopefully could answer some of the questions before, but there are different ways that you can get a sample into a GCMS. So the purpose of thermal desorption, as it was mentioned, is to take as large a sample as possible and concentrate it down to look at very trace levels, all the way down to part per trillion. But it's not limited to that. You can also take very small grab samples. You could take a 50 milliliter sample and then focus that down and analyze it, perhaps using a more sensitive detector. So the purpose of this is that wide analyte range, all the way from your hydrogen sulfide, formaldehyde, ethene, ethane, acetylene, your very volatiles, all the way through to your heavy PAHs, your phthalates, your plasticizers. Now, the limitation is you can't do all of that in one run. Column technology, unfortunately, is not there yet. We have to be able to separate these compounds. But how do we get that sample into our GCMS? And I shouldn't say this in front of a couple of our sales representatives in the room, because the analytical instrumentation is the big expensive piece of kit, right? Honestly, if you don't sample properly, none of that matters, okay? You can take any thermal desorption GCMS. Of course you should buy from Marks, but you can take any analytical instrumentation that shows you that. If you don't sample properly, it doesn't matter. Garbage in, garbage out, that kind of thing is really important. So one of the things we do in ISO or in SEN or in ASTM is make sure that our sampling methods are really robust. And that's what's important in this case. So whether we take a filter, we can take your particulate matter filter, we can roll it up, we can put it into an empty tube. I'm going to go somewhat show and tell, but these are the tubes that we're looking at. So this is a stainless steel tube. We can have empty tubes and we can push that particulate filter matter in there, and we can heat that up and release the volatiles and semi-volatiles from your particulate matter and actually speciate what's on there. So you can see what chemicals are making up that particulate matter. Or you can take a pumped sample onto a sorbent tube that's got multiple adsorbents inside, and the sample will go in, your semi-volatiles get trapped on your weaker adsorbent at the front. The middle sorbent is a bit more strong and it'll trap your volatile compounds. And then you've got really strong sorbents that back that up, that can trap those very volatile compounds. So it's these multiple adsorbents that allow you to trap that wide range of analytes. Once your sample's on your tube, then we can put it in the instrument. I'll show you a diagram that's a bit easier to see than me waving a tube around. Passive sampling, canisters, online. If we're using canisters and online, We don't use tubes. We actually use what's inside the analytical instrument. Again, sorry, I know this is really small, but inside the analytical instrument is a focusing trap. This focusing trap also contains those adsorbent materials. We can hold this focusing trap at negative temperatures using Peltier coolers, not using liquid cryogen because we don't want to add additional complications into our laboratory. So for those online analysis that we were talking about, that PAMs or canisters, we take a sample directly onto this at low temperatures, and what that low temperature does is increases the capacity of the sorbent inside, and that's how we can trap things that we cannot trap in a sorbent tube. Formaldehyde, hydrogen sulfide, ethene, acetylene, those type of compounds we do directly onto there. All of that analytical technology, and the question I get asked the most is, what sorbent should I use? What sorbent should I use to trap the compounds I'm interested in? So when we look at sorbents, quartz wool is what we use. Looks like cotton wool, but it's made from quartz, it's inert. That's what traps our really big, bulky molecules. Phthalates, plasticizers, PCBs, and then Tenax is probably the one that most of you will be familiar with. Traps anywhere from C7 through to C30. Now, the problem is a lot of people only use Tenax. Benzene is something that we're really interested in atmospheric chemistry. Benzene is just on the limit of what you can quantitatively retain on Tenax, which is why we tend to suggest that you use a combination of graphitized carbons with the porous polymer if you're doing ambient air monitoring. So that multiple group of sorbents in the tube. The other thing about Tenax is it creates artifacts if you don't condition it, and one of those artifacts is benzene. And we can analyze picogram levels of benzene, so we don't want any of that on the back of our tubes. So the other thing that's really important is just making sure that you clean those tubes properly before you analyze them. Okay, so we've explained this already. So the sample's taken onto the tube. All of the permanent gases go straight through the tube, and all of the compounds of interest are trapped on that tube. Nitrogen, argon, carbon dioxide, oxygen all pass through the tube. When we put that into the analytical instrument, we then heat it and reverse the flow in the opposite direction, because otherwise all of those big bulky molecules that we trapped on that first sorbent would get pushed down onto that really strong sorbent, and they get stuck and bound, and we'd never be able to get them off. So we sample on in one direction, off in the other direction. We call that back flushing, and that's really important for that breakthrough question that you asked earlier. If we heated this tube up and we sent it straight to our GC column, we'd have a problem, because we'd have to inject a couple of 100 milliliters to get everything off of this tube, and we'd have horrendous chromatography for those of you that are analytical chemists in the room. So what we need to do is we need to pre-focus it prior to injection to the GC column, which is where we use this focusing trap. So sorbent tube, we analyze out in the field, we bring it back, we pop it in that auto sampler, we heat it up, we reverse the flow through the tube, we take the sample onto the focusing trap. Again, with a weak, medium and strong sorbent, we go on in one direction. This can be held, if you've sampled out in the atmosphere, this doesn't need to go below room temperature because it has the same capacity. So we hold this at room temperature, all our sample goes onto here, and then now what we can do is we can reverse that flow again to our GC column and inject 1 microliter or so of gas onto the front of the column. And that's what gives us those really nice peak shapes so that we can identify very low trace level compounds of interest. So sorry for the slight 101 of analytical chemistry there, because I know a lot of you are very familiar, but I just want to make sure everyone understands how that works. So again, we've touched on this, we've got a really broad portfolio. You can take a sample using a tube, online, canister. We can do 24-hour, 7 days a week monitoring, but we can also use headspace trap, or SPEMI fiber trap, or high capacity sorptive extraction trap. So we can, it's all about just identifying those low levels, whether we've focused on air today, but it could be in liquid or in soil for sorptive extraction from those as well. We're cryogen free, we can run on hydrogen. Sustainability is key for many analytical laboratories. We also have a ton of built-in validation techniques that are written into standard methods. You need to be able to leak test. You need to be able to add internal standard addition. You need to be able to ensure that the data that you're getting is defensible. We're talking about some really serious kind of policy that we're going to make on this about whether or not the data is correct or not. And we talked about it in your presentation. If you don't have traceability and accountability of the data, it means nothing. I've put this on here just to reiterate. Sorry? Yeah, Sentry is just, so we've got lots of different models when it comes to pre-concentration systems. Some of them, we know that people are just going to run tubes. So if you're only ever going to run tubes, you've got a TD100, which is a 100 tube auto sampler. If you're going to run online or canisters, with the addition of tubes if you want, then you would have one of our modular systems based on an air server or a CIA Advantage. If you are doing specific weird and wonderful things with greenhouse gases and chemical weapons, we have some specific instruments called Medusa or Nuvo. But Sentry is our extraction and enrichment platform. So what this does is allows you to run tubes as you would with a traditional thermal desorption system, but it also, in varying different guises, allows you to take headspace vials to a focusing trap. So you can do multi-stage enrichment of headspace. So it's really useful for things like fumigants. We do a lot of work with ethylene oxide in food stock, taking multiple aliquots from a headspace vial onto a focusing trap before injection to a GC. We can use SPME fibers. So if you're using SPME fibers, yes, so you can use solid and liquid phase, but you can also just use air on there. So if you're an environmental test laboratory that wants to do air, water, soil, materials, we always recommend Sentry because it allows you to add all these different bells and whistles onto it. If you are a air lab that's just doing BTEX and you will never touch anything else, then you would go for the TD100. So, and that's what we would advise on depending on your applications. Okay, so just to highlight a point, these are all of the sampling consumables that we run. We have things like a VOC, which is where you can put a sorbent tube in and go straight into the ground and analyze VOCs in the ground, looking at vapor intrusion from old petroleum sites, all the way through to using it in slightly morbid scenarios where we look at the emission from cadavers or dead bodies to then be able to do forensic analysis when someone's found in that type of scenario. Canisters, microscale chambers, which I'll go to in a moment. Okay, how much time do I have? What time is it? 10 more minutes and then I'm done, I'm sorry. So I'd like to just really touch on indoor air quality because ambient air quality, and especially in the global situation, is quite heavily regulated and very well known. So these methods that we've been talking about are so well validated. We've been running them in Europe and the US for 30 years consistently. They are very well known. What we've started to see a lot more of, especially post-COVID, is a lot of us spend a huge amount of time indoors, and all of the items that we have indoors are possibly, in certain scenarios, causing us more harm than the outdoor air quality. So one of the things that we have in this situation is we have a much wider range of compounds and a much differing level of volatility that are causing those problems. So everything from your typical solvents, residual polymers, all the way through to plasticizers. You know, if we're sat, which I often do, you know, on my sofa with my laptop on, it gets warm, there's all those plastics in there. I'm just breathing in phthalates as I'm kind of doing my work on a weekend, which I shouldn't, but I do. All the way through to scented candles, incense, any of those types of things, all that for us. Cooking. Cooking is one that's really, really regionally specific. But if we use any kind of fuels in our home other than some of the gases that we use, that can also be really detrimental to human health as well. In the UK, we've just banned wood-burning stoves and fires within homes, or at least heavily recommended that you don't use them because of the pollution inside the home. It's not just human health though, it's also public perception. So consumer product manufacturers, material manufacturers now realize that if something has a chemical smell, you open something and you get, you know, a face full of chemicals, and it's associated with low cost products. It's not always the case, but it's associated with it. So there's quite a bit of personal concern with regards to those products. So when it comes to anyone who works in test lab or in validation, there's three things we're looking at: human health, customer comfort, and then product performance. Our laptops work using semiconductors. Those semiconductors only perform at a high level if they're not contaminated with volatile compounds. So people in this world also look at that. Lithium batteries. When we get on an aircraft, we all know that we're not allowed to put any batteries in the checked luggage, and that's because of the explosion of some of the lithium batteries. That's just an excess release of VOCs and swelling gases within those lithium batteries that cause those explosions. So there's a vast amount of VOC and SVOC testing done within indoor air quality. We're a little bit more harmonised across the world on indoor air quality, I think, because it's less contentious and because we're all kind of coming to it at the same time. ISO is absolutely leading the standardisation of these methods, but any kind of implementation of air quality guidelines either comes from the EU Clean Air Policy, which takes the WHO guidelines for public health. I won't go into this, but each individual country has their own focus, whether that's what is called sick building syndrome in Japan and Singapore, all the way through to the US EPA, who actually look at it from an occupational safety and health perspective. We measure air quality in interiors, but the reality is all of that comes from the products and materials. So the regulations are actually on flooring materials, on paints, on foams, on seating, on any kind of construction products. And they all come either under REACH, under what the European Union calls substances of very high concern, or the construction product regulation. So in Europe, we have very heavy regulation, and actually many countries that import into Europe will be very familiar with this because you have to comply to those. The US does it somewhat differently. It's in the building code. So when an architect is asked to build a new building, they have to use low emitting materials to comply with that. And then they have the Toxic Substance Control Act. One of the main committees that is used to write all of the standard methods that are used for what are termed interior environments. And what's really interesting, it's not just indoor air quality. This is in aircraft air quality. This is in vehicle air quality. So those of you, I always joke because it's the same in the UK. Those of you who want to buy a nice high-end German car and you get in and you have that lovely new car smell, is now heavily regulated in the European Union, in China and in Japan and Korea. Even natural products like leather are really struggling because the VOC emissions within the interior are set so low for new car smell or for vehicle interior emissions. So we have specific working groups within ISO looking at the determination of VOCs in indoor air, which is what I chair. And then there's microbial contaminants, vehicle interior air quality, sensory testing, flame retardants. We've moved into volatile organic compounds, which covers phthalates, PCBs, PAHs, and plasticizers. And then we have the airborne particulate matters. And then we've disbanded the quality management systems, but we also have like new things like air cleaners and the assessment of their perceived air quality. Because I don't know if you have this trend in India, but we have it in Europe where you can go on Amazon and there's like 1 million different air cleaners that you can buy for your home. None of them have been tested. No one knows whether they are actually any good at what they do, and no one is validating them. So we are trying to come up with standard methodology to validate those because it's a real problem, because people think they're doing a good thing. They're putting them in schools and hospitals. No one's monitoring what they're actually doing. Yeah. Oh, brilliant. Because even the manufacturers don't know what we should talk, because I'd love to implement it. Okay, so this is the end of my presentation, but I just wanted to highlight that when it's indoor air quality, we can take pumps, very similar to what we've done before, pump sampling for C3 to C44. Unfortunately, if you want to take an offline sample, formaldehyde and acetaldehyde cannot be sampled onto these adsorbent tubes. There is no sorbent strong enough to trap them. So they are taken onto DMPH cartridges, which are the way that they are done, but they do come with quite a lot of variability. So they're a bit of an unknown quantity at the moment. So aldehydes taken onto DMPH cartridges and analysed using HPLC. If we're testing materials, there are some standard methods, typically in this ISO 16000 series, where we have chambers ranging from very small microchambers, even putting material directly into a tube for nano chambers, small chambers which are 1 meter cubed, all the way through to chambers that are large enough to fit a vehicle or even a truck inside. And again, same analytical methodology. And then finally, little microchambers, direct absorption, much more useful for those of you who are carrying out materials testing on a traditional basis. Final slide, I promise. What's next? PFAS. I did just want to touch on this because if any of you are interested in emerging contaminants or research into emerging contaminants, I'd say 4 years ago, no one was talking about PFAS in air. No one even mentioned it. They were starting to talk about PFAS in water, and the regulations in the US were coming along. But now we have standard methodology for looking at what we call products of incomplete destruction. So this is anyone who is destroying PFAS materials. When you break them down, they create a bunch of greenhouse gases. So things that you can validate to see that they've broken down properly. So US EPA OTM 50 is a method that measures CF4, C2F6 as precursors or marker compounds, I should say, for the destruction of PFAS compounds. You have to incinerate them at 1500 degrees C to incinerate these compounds. So that's a very implemented method now in the US. In Europe, we are typically kind of looking at the US method and going, it's okay, but we can do better. And so now we're rewriting it in a different way, which again, may or may not be the right thing to do, but that's what we've decided to do. PFAS in ambient air is very much research-based. It is your Greenpeaces, your national ambient institutes looking at the far-flung places to see if we can find PFAS where we shouldn't be able to find it. Landfill gases are being regulated for PFAS with emissions from perimeters. Food contact material is absolutely key. Pretty much all our food contact material has PFAS in it. It's now being banned. And so there's a high amount of regulation through either AOAC in Europe or in other organizations. Indoor air, there are 2 ASTM methods looking specifically at fluorotelema alcohols, which are some of the PFAS that we know cause human health issues. And then we have the military and other kind of first responders looking at things like firefighting foam, which has a vast amount of PFAS in, which is very detrimental to the health of our workers in those fields. And then also textiles and clothing. All waterproof clothing has PFAS, so they're all being regulated on that as well. So if you want any information on that, we can go into a bit more detail. And then please indulge me because my next slide is a bit tongue-in-cheek because this is how I spent my first day in India. So I'd just like to thank you very much for your time. Thank you. Yeah, okay, well, let's take that off because I don't want that on there whilst we're talking. Okay, so microplastics, microplastics in soil and water is well known, right? But when you look at vehicles, especially, and you look at urban pollution, what we're realizing now is that a lot of the ultrafine particles and nanoparticles that are coming from the wear of tires, I think the last statistic I saw was that 85 to 90% of microplastics come from vehicle tires. So if you are in an urban environment and you have schools or hospitals and we're measuring the volatiles and we're measuring the particulate matter as a number, but we're not looking at the source of where those come from. So now what we're doing is we're taking the particulate filter and we are directly desorbing it. So no sorbent inside the tube, just an empty tube, and we're pushing that into here, heating it and looking for marker compounds for the polymers. Now that's not a perfect science because a marker compound for polystyrene is styrene, and styrene is a pollutant. So what we're also looking at as well, which is a new application, is offline pyrolysis, because pyrolysis is very good at identifying So if we take offline pyrolysis, but we then draw the off-gassing from that pyrolyzer onto a sorbent tube.
This can be used as a proxy.
Yeah, so exactly. So we can not only identify which polymers are there, but we can look at the additives. And for example, we can tell from the additives whether it's a Coca-Cola bottle that the microplastics come from, a plastic carrier bag or a tire, because we know what compounds are used to make those products. So it's kind of a forensic analysis of microplastics. Yeah, exactly that. Exactly that.
In indoor air, what type of VOCs we should monitor or SVOCs?
Okay, so in indoor air, there's a list of compounds that is called the European lowest compounds of interest, the LCIs. There's a list of about 200 compounds that affect human health that are typical from materials in indoor air. So that's the first place I'd look. But it's 200 compounds. And like I said, there's no need to go from nothing to everything immediately, right? So traditionally in indoor air, you're looking at the BTEX compounds. You're looking at some of the alkanes. So it's hexane to hexadecane tends to be the kind of range. The BTEX compounds, and then a couple of compounds like acrolein, acetaldehyde, formaldehyde. Those tend to be the compounds of interest. I can give you some papers that have all of that information in. No problem.
I think that will vary according to your workflow. What kind of the regulation?
Uniform them for the all types of indoor air. Like
so where they are regulated at the moment, you're right. Yeah. So where they're regulated at the moment is Japan, Korea. It's not regulated in Europe. It is strongly suggested, so everyone does it. And in the US, there are different limit levels and different compounds of interest. So you're quite right. It is different, but there tends to be 8 compounds that are uniform across everyone, which is your BTEX and those. And then Japan, for example, has a pesticide on their list, which is, I think, because they have wooden homes, and it was used a lot in the use of the wooden of the wood. So they have one pesticide in their list. China has acrolein in the list. Other countries don't have acrolein in their list. Europe states a bunch, and actually in the US, phthalates and plasticizers are now becoming of more interest because most products are relatively low emitting. But the reality is if we have open fires, we have cooking implementation, or we burn candles or incense, you're going to get more from that than you are from your foam from your seat. In America, they use spray polyurethane foam for insulation. That is now being heavily regulated because it's a bunch of really nasty amines, catalysts, those types of compounds. So it does vary region to region, product to product. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Sorry I took so long. Okay.